This panel will have a more conversational dynamic with questions and between the moderator and the panelists. Within the framework of this dynamic, and if the time allows it, the moderator will be collecting the questions that arise in the chat. We invite you then to leave your questions in the language of your preference in the chat function throughout this panel. And now I turn the floor over to Pablo Cevallos Estarellas, Director of the IIEP Office for Latin America and the Caribbean, who will be in charge of the moderation. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mercedes, and good morning or good afternoon. In this panel number 2, the focus will be on examining critically 3 initiatives that took place within the framework of educational reforms in our region, which were aimed at improving student learning in order to understand what prevented or hindered the successful implementation. To this end, the panel will include the participation of 3 people who in recent decades have held the highest responsibility in the management of educational policies in their respective countries, Ecuador, Mexico, and Peru, and who in that capacity were the heads or leaders of educational reforms that became very well known at the regional level and were certainly not free of controversy, which probably makes them even more interesting. Well, these 3 brave people have accepted our invitation to participate in this panel, and we are extremely grateful. And I said that they're brave because when we invited them, we told them that we wanted them to tell us and reflect on a policy that sought to improve student learning, but was not as successful as expected. And not satisfied with this, we also asked them to try to identify the main mistakes they believe were made in the planning and or implementation of such policies. And we finally ask you to conclude by saying what would be the main lessons learned from the experience you're about to tell us about. As I said in the introduction to the regional forum, our idea is that we can better understand these mistakes and therefore learn from these mistakes to avoid making them in the future. I think that this is possible to the extent that the mistakes we analyze can be derived from common characteristics or problems of the countries in the region, but we'll see this during the discussion. Okay, so who do we have here honoring us in this panel? And they're going to speak in alphabetical order. First, Gloria Vidal Illingworth, former Minister of Education of Ecuador from 2010 to 2013 and Vice Minister from 2006 to 2010. And then Otto Granados Roldan, former Secretary of Public Education in Mexico, and he was subsecretary from 2015 to 2017. And then Patricia Salas O'Brien, former Minister of Education of Peru from 2011 to 2013. All 3 panelists have brilliant careers. They're very well known and recognized in the region. And as they know, they have earned my full admiration and professional respect. Well, that said, and due to time constraints, I will not recount their professional achievements, but you can Google them. I will only say, in honor of the truth and in the interest of full disclosure, like they say, that in the case of Gloria, it will be a little more difficult for me to be impartial than in the cases of Otto and Patricia, because I was part of the management in the Ministry of Education of Ecuador between 2007 and 2013, and I became vice minister when Gloria was minister. This, of course, constitutes a difficulty for objectivity, but it will not diminish. It may perhaps even increase my vocation for critical analysis when reviewing the Ecuadorian case, given that I inevitably know it more firsthand, let's say, than others. I will now concentrate on briefly explaining the mechanics of this panel. This panel will have a total duration of 75 minutes, and unlike the other 2 panels of the regional forum, this one will have a dialogue or a conversational dynamic. Each panelist will have a maximum of 8 minutes to explain his or her example, and the interventions will have as a trigger the following question. Of the actions aimed at improving learning developed during your administration, Which one could you mention that did not have the impact that was sought? Why did it not? And what would you do differently if you had the opportunity again? In other words, we ask each panelist to respond to the previous question by developing the following 3 points that compose it. And these are: 1, briefly explain a policy aimed at improving learning that was implemented during your tenure, but that did not have the positive impact that was originally planned. 2, identify the main mistake you believe was made in the planning or implementation of the policy. And 3, comment on what you would do differently if you had to do it over again. Or better said, what was the lesson learned? I think that's the most interesting part, maybe. Once each panelist finishes his or her presentation, a dialogue or debate will be opened between the panelists or amongst the panelists for a maximum of 14 minutes. I hope that I will just, as a moderator, do some sporadic interventions. And then the same mechanism will be repeated later first with Gloria, then Otto, then Patricia. Finally, as time allows, we will open a space for questions from the audience. So I suggest that you write them down in the chat function, and my colleagues will collect them, systematize them, and send them to me. But like I said, that depends on time. We're a little bit behind, but we will do the best we can. I am going to try to make sure that we stick to the time that we have. So please, panelists, don't get mad at me if I tell you that time is almost up. We just want all three to have the same time for a presentation and discussion. Each panelist will monopolize the camera in the first 4 minutes of their presentation. After that, I will also appear on camera, and next to my image, you'll see a timer that will count down the remaining 4 minutes. And when there are only 2 minutes left, I will mention to you, hey, you have 2 minutes left. That way, I give you the opportunity to close if you were still far from finishing. When the 8 minutes are up, your opportunity to speak is not over. Simply, we open it up for discussion, okay? So if all is okay with you, let's begin with Gloria Vidal. She's going to talk to us about an experience that she had in Ecuador. Gloria?
Bueno, muchísimas gracias. Es un gusto estar con todos ustedes.
Thank you so much. It is a pleasure to be here with all of you in the 6th Regional Forum. It isn't very common in our region to reflect on what didn't work out. Usually, we pat ourselves on the back for everything that actually was successful. After seeing the presentations today, I could mention some of the studies where Ecuador made a huge leap in academic achievements after an evolution that was product of a educational transformation. But today we're here for another reason. And I would like to say hello and send my regards to my 2 colleagues, Otto and Patricia, because it's just like Pablo said, we do need to have a space to reflect, and it has to be an interesting space. We have to know where we failed to create public policies, why these public policies didn't bring us the results we expected. Panel number 3 will have a series of specialists that will talk about how to create a policy so that it is successful and how that successful arrives and trickles down to the classrooms. And we will see in this particular panel how these policies, despite the fact that they were created like that, they didn't produce that success, that we desired. In our case, we were also asked to choose one of those 4 recommendations that were mentioned in the previous interventions that were canonical interventions, quote unquote. So those interventions were all the educational transformations focus on. One is the curriculum, and I will discuss that. As of December 2015, in Ecuador, we began an educational transformation. And who participated? Well, the population. In what sense? Well, it was taken to the public in 2006. So there were 8 lines of a policy that would allow the citizens to participate actively in the construction of these policies. In the case of the curriculum in Ecuador, in the different levels and modalities, the curricula were kind of behind compared to others in the region. And it had the practical needs of being renewed constantly so that these curricula would adapt to this world that is so ever changing. In the case of secondary school, as it was described, had its origin in the decade of the 60s, and there were transformations in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, but it was just kind of maintained as a hyper specialized secondary school, a secondary school that specialized early on. And in some cases, at age 14, the students had to choose one area or another, either, for example, science, physics, math, chemistry, biology, or social sciences that was within modern humanity. And in the first year of high school, so when they're 14, 15, they so 50% of the curriculum was dedicated to that hyper specialization. And as they advanced in secondary school and got to the last year of high school, this load had to reach 92%. So what did that provoke? Well, students wouldn't really get to know areas of knowledge that belong to other segments. And I want to give you an example. That meant that if I, for example, took the case of physics and mathematics specialization, well, that meant that I wasn't going to take any classes like philosophy, literature, etc.
What did this cost? The people that would graduate from this type of school would bias their later decisions so that they would take early on decisions that were not validated by them, but by their parents. So a teenager from 14 years old had to decide if he wanted to be a physician. So maybe at 18, after studying chemistry, maybe he wanted to be a lawyer. So in that case, if his studies would take a bias to chemistry and biology, it was uh, very unlikely for him to enter a college career. So this is just to give you a high-level overview of high school. So when we face the challenge of structuring a new high school, we began roundtables with specialists, with universities, with public sectors, as the production chambers, and we began to build, and we opened our webpage so that citizens could give their opinions about this new high school. We had more than 200,000 visits, so there was a high degree of participation from people, specialists, and different educational institutions. However, after some time and thinking about the progressivity of its implementation, so the entire high school was not implemented entirely 1 year. It was implemented gradually 1 year at a time, but it found a lot of problems. One of the problems that I could point out is the difficulty that to find the professional profiles of the teachers that gave classes in high schools with specialization to do a reskilling or an upskilling of their competencies to adapt to the new curriculum. I think that we can now go on to the questions, maybe? Yes, of course. Well, some questions first so that the audience can better understand the context. So first, I think an explanation that's important. Not all the countries of the country use the word bachillerato. That means high schools. Here, for example, we call the 3 last years of high school, just to put everybody on the same page. But the first question before I turn the floor to the others and to establish a discussion is to explain better, Gloria, what was the main mistake, if we can say that? What was the core issue? And together, how would you do things different now? What was your lesson learned? I think that maybe in the dynamic of addressing educational transformation, we should have greater periods of time. We have to have much more time and profound discussion about this reform with much more consensus involving a lot more people. And this construction or implementation should be more progressive. It should be not implemented in urgent terms. We should make it more gradual. So we have to go much more deeper to get the participation of different social actors in its building and to have a more gradual implementation. And maybe there would be a third element, which would be the definite participation in the connection with the universities and the labor market. Okay, perfect. Well, I think that you say refers to this problem that we have in many countries, not only in our region, but worldwide. When you have this kind of swing movement from a left wing to a right wing government, the first thing they do is to change the curriculum immediately. So we have this curriculum that lasts a couple of years, and then we have another government, and then they swing back to what they used to do, as happened in Spain. But I think that your answer to my second question is, so if you think of what you would have to do, you would consider these 3 points that you mentioned. Okay, so now I will ask Otto and then Patricia. Otto, you are muted. Well, thank you, Pablo. Gloria, what really strikes me in your abstract, now you just mentioned this, having the discussion of all the citizens. This discussion among citizens was among specialized circles. It lacked going deeper. Did it reach parents or the media to have a richer discussion and go deeper in the objectives of the changes? Well, right now, while managing, we thought that we had gone deep enough. But now, in retrospective, I think we should have had a deeper discussion. We had discussion with teachers and the academia, and there was an opening of the Ministry of Education portal, so all citizens, parents, students, everybody could be able to input their opinions, give suggestions, criticize, to build this new curriculum. And many of these opinions were incorporated in the elaboration of the curriculum.
Y pensamos que con la profundidad
So we thought that we had done this with enough deepness, but now thinking in retrospective, because 11 years have gone by, and 12 years after the discussion of this public hearing, I think that especially here, we should incorporate more citizens and incorporate or engage other ways of participation, because there is no appropriation if there is no participation. If we don't have a broad participation, it's more difficult to sustain a policy. And that is applicable to any case of public policies. I would like to comment on this. Good morning to everybody. So what are we looking for when we want to engage more participation? We want to know what the population really wants, what they think things should be. In this case, the curriculum for their children or for the students themselves. We also want to legitimize the public policy or this appropriation dynamic that you were mentioning. This is kind of concerning, this issue of participation, because we've been working on that for a long time, and we always end up in a situation where we look back and think that we did not have enough participation. But we should ask ourselves what we were looking for with this increased participation. And if this participation should be in a formulation phase or in a follow-up phase. No, we will never achieve the level of participation that we would like to have, but how do you see that? How did you go about uh, gathering and systematizing and deciding who will participate or not? And how does this affect this participation of all citizens? And the other thing is the technical consistency, that we are the ones who are responsible for that. How did you live that? How did you see that? Well, I think that the answer to the first question of part of your question has to do with the fact that we want to avoid a disconnection between the formulation of the policies that is on the table of specialists of the Ministry of Education in the territory and the field. So I think it's essential that we should not have this disconnect. We know the technical aspects, we have specialists that can articulate the proposal, but we have to listen. I think more than any other ministry, the Ministry of Education has to listen carefully. It has to be willing to listen so that their processes be discussed with the population. The technical aspects is a matter of specialists. Of course, citizens can give you a lot of suggestions and motivations and issues that are very relevant. And the technicians or the experts should transform this in response with relevant instruments. But I don't think we should promote the connection with the territories, with the fields. I mean, citizens and other type of social organizations or corporate groups or the academia of university networks. I think that the discussion should be a broad one. Can I make a comment?
A ver, yo creo que las tres
I
cosas
think that the three things that Patricia mentions are not incompatible. On the one hand, as everything in the teaching science, sometimes it's not easy to communicate effectively to the general audience or to the parents, but we have to do that. But we also have the process of follow-up. In this case, we can we can have that with a good exercise of participation. And the decision makers, like the Ministry of Education, feel supported politically by the public opinion, especially if the process of the changes is complicated or very complicated or conflictive. So in this sense, I think that we should increase the intensity and quality of that participation, or drive to have citizens with higher intensity participation that can understand and support the magnitude of the changes. And allow me to respond to their comments. There's something very important. In terms of transparency, and the public instances should be transparent, it's important to get to know the instruments and the contents of the debate. The citizens should know this, in addition to gathering all their suggestions. But we should have a feedback of what citizens think about a certain public policy. Of course, once this public policy is built and implemented to the territory, the pertinent adjustment should be made according to the demands of the territory. We also have to see how much the demand of citizens is in agreement with the public administration and how much it collides with us, with that. We also have to understand what the press can, what their position they can have, for example, an active opposition to that policy. So, you know, of course, you have to work according to majorities, but you also know that there are minorities that are much better organized and they can present their opposition. So how can we balance this? Because wanting it or not, the general population does not have that level of organization and that voice. So how can we balance that? Because that's really complicated. Yes, of course. This is why I was talking about the exercise that we carried out by opening participation through websites, through a portal. So there, anybody, it's a really democratic exercise, anybody can enter and partake of this process with his or her own voice to define public policies. So I think that there's an exercise that we are not accustomed to do in the region, and that it is important to do it, regardless of liking or not the commentary or the suggestions made. We had 180,000 visits to the portal of the Ministry of Education from students, parents, citizens, general public, or that left their comments. Now, processing that information requires an enormous effort. It would be much easier that the ministers of education would sign the agreements that carry out the change. This is a much longer, time-consuming process, but it's much more valid and it's much more democratic. I have to interrupt you for a minute, just a minute, Patricia. Your time is up, so I want to end this debate. Of course, is very interesting, and we're going to resume that after we listen to the other colleagues. But it is clear that in all these processes of citizen participation that made with the idea to get their ideas and also to make the changes owned by society, there's always a tension, because participation cannot be eternal, and it cannot, you cannot make everybody participate. There will always be people saying that They didn't ask me. But with this more democratic processes, because maybe the political stakeholders will not go down to that level, they would look for other types of interactions. So let's go to the next presentation, Otto. Let's begin with your presentation. You will have 8 minutes, and when you only have 2 minutes left, I will tell you so that you can conclude, and then we will have 14 minutes to discuss. Thank you very much for your invitation. And this invitation of Pablo Cevallos was a almost psychoanalytic provocation, because he is making us think out of the box. He's asked us to think what we did wrong, to be able to define lesson learned, and also share the experience to have a more efficient transition between the what's that require a lot of data and the how to implement those policies. In the 3 questions that Pablo asked us, we had certain components. Just to give a context, in the case of the Mexican educational reform was one of the most important ones, and it was implemented between 2013 and 2018. And I would signal out, following the agenda that Pablo asked us, 3 important aspects. The first problem or dilemma that we face is what came first, the egg or the chicken? The Mexican educational system grew a lot. We had 200,000 schools, more than 2 million workers, 23 million students, but in parallel, a political cooperativist structure was built that generates a space of colonization of the Ministry of Education. And the decisions were not that easy. So the reform was designed to first professionalize the entry to the teaching profession. Now, it will be based on merit. And second, create a national evaluation education system, both for teachers and for students. And in third place, to put in place a new educational model. So when we followed this order that we were facing the corporation, the birth of the reform generated a lot of conflicts with the political groups and with unions, because it changed the rules of the game, and it caused some shock with unions and produced antibodies to have an efficient implementation, and also antibodies to the acceptance of that reform. So this change in the legal framework not only changed the status quo of the 2 entities, but also the way of life of the establishment. So the first hypothesis is that maybe it's possible that the evolution of the reform maybe would have faced less conflicts if they would have begun with a soft landing, beginning with the technical teaching aspects that arrived to a lot of consensus and agreements. We had a very rich dialogue with very good quality of deliverables. And maybe if we had begun there, maybe we could have created trust within all the educational community to reduce resistance to the new evaluation system.
So maybe if we had done that, these levels of conflict would have been lower. Secondly, as a consequence of what I mentioned first and what Gloria was saying, like I said, the Mexican reform started from a very complex design, constitutional changes, regulation changes, a new system that was very competitive and transparent. So in 2013, when this happens amidst a lot of tension, legislators and designers of this reform assumed that reforming the laws was equivalent to achieving the desired changes. And this produced a lack of communication that was quite interesting, and it manifested in the imaginary, in the collective imaginary, that it impacted the interest of faculty, and it actually had an impact on the legitimacy of the reform itself. Why? Because the Ministry of Education and the National Institute of Education executed in the first 3 years a strategy of information that was detailed and believable, and that helped the uncertainty amidst people. There were surveys in 2015 that showed that almost 89% of people surveyed said that it was not an educational reform, it was a political reform. 58% said that they wanted there to be positions that were long-term or even tenured. So in 2016, there was this lack of communication that was quite interesting. It was psychologically complex because on one hand, it seemed to be creating a sense of freedom for faculty. So now they could enter this career, stay in this career, and grow in this career. You have 2 minutes left, Otto. Okay, but at the same time, they went against that sense of freedom because it contrasted with the sense of security and stability. These are crucial aspects of professional life, and historically, they were more linked to the modus operandi, and this created a dissonance, a cognitive dissonance, in my opinion. And the report described it like the security for freedom seems to be a trade-off that we all think about. And then they said, what's new doesn't mean safety or security. And the work that was done in the last 2 years was insufficient, and maybe it arrived a little late to achieve a more efficient and more transparent and more real communication. And thirdly, and this is what I want to finish off with, is what can we do differently? Well, I think that we should have created a much better coalition between citizens and organizations of civil society in favor of the reform that would constitute or make up a positive pressure to all players. So citizens towards politicians, governors, legislators, and this would boost cooperation and make it easier to have a reform. We'll talk about it further on. I don't have any more time now, but in my opinion, it was impossible to create this citizen coalition that would become the basis of the educational reform. It would have had other outcomes, like we saw in our colleague's presentation about the OECD. So that's what I wanted to say. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Otto. That was so interesting. I also think it's interesting to say how similar, I mean, how many similarities I see from the between the situation that you were telling us about and the issue seems to have been in both cases an issue of not being able to reach a consensus amongst citizens. And in the specific case of Mexico, here's a question. Do you think, I mean, from what you just said, right, about having been able to do this differently, and you emphasize a lot on the coalition of citizens and getting people to support a project like this one, but is that feasible? Is it sustainable if you have the opposition of the people that work in the educational system, because it seems that for reasons that you quickly mentioned, that was the case of Mexico. I mean, if there would have been support from citizens, there was opposition from the union and faculty. So I don't know if you wanted to make that more clear before we go into Q&A. Well, yes. I just remembered what Pablo Picasso used to say. You can never speak ill of yourself. That's what other people are for. But let's try. I think both are correct, Pablo. On the one hand, the political union activism was very important in the discussion of the reform, and consequently in the possibility of reaching a consensus, an organic consensus, an articulated consensus. I mean, we wanted the players involved in the educational network and in civil society to be an influence and a pressure to those people that make decisions in the Congress and legislators and means of communication, for example. And that connection, that link, I don't think was strong enough, or it wasn't strong enough on time, let's say. And the surveys from 2018 versus 2015, I mean, the figures changed a lot, significantly. The levels of approval of surveys have increased 20, 25 points. The surveys between parents, I'm sorry, of what? Of the reform, approval of the reform. Yes, 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 of course. And in some specific components like teacher assessment, they also increased considerably. These were the surveys last year. And then countries as large as Mexico and other countries, like, I mean, countries as big as Mexico talk about, for example, cases that are very important. In Mexico, we have 3 states that have been very successful, and we feel that with some levels, we had more synergy and more support, of course, and their points of view were more coherent than in other areas in the country. I mean, Mexico is very large. We have a lot of Mexicos within Mexico. I have so many things I would like to ask, but Patricia?
La reforma magisterial que nos ha tocado
Well,
de una u otra manera, ¿no es cierto?
the reform that all countries have gone through in one way or another is a very specific reform, because we have specific players whose interests are directly impacted. I mean, you were talking about how you benefit the society with a change, but here you're going to lose, for example, the possibility to have job security, etc. Do you, I mean, I agree with reaching a consensus. I think that that is a path for public management and political management. But don't you think that focusing so much on consensus makes us forget about the opposition that may pop up, or dissent? A lot of political players like Congress people or governors, they will prefer their popularity over good for others, over doing good for others. So I don't know what your reflections are, Otto. Yes, you're right. I couldn't have said it better, to be honest. I think that in this case, there are certain components of the Mexican educational reform that were exploited for votes. In that sense, there's always a dilemma. there are good decisions that are not popular, and there are bad decisions that are very popular. So, well, sometimes you're at a crossroad, and you have to decide to go after the first. If you want a good reform, in this case, a reform that has quality, that focuses on equity and inclusion, when these reforms are subject to political marketing, well, they usually generate issues. And if one of the players eventually has the capacity to veto, that's even worse. And if there is a lack of consistency within the government regarding the conflicts that a reform can generate, and there is no unity in terms of sense of purpose, well, that makes it a lot more complicated to have a reform of this type. I completely agree with what you said. We need high level of approvals and support, but that doesn't necessarily have to come from a level of consensus, just like you stated very well. Otto, I wanted to reflect with you on citizen participation. I'd like to hear your opinion about this. In our dear Latin America, many times the participation of citizens is subject traditionally to a vote every 4 years, or to exercising your right to vote and to your rights, but there is no construction of citizenship. So I think that that is what, at a certain point, doesn't allow us to go after these public policies and claim them afterwards when these political policies or public policies are not put into use by other governments. They're not implemented by other governments. The right doesn't exist, or it's not sustained throughout time so that it can actually have an impact. I mean, the new government can dismantle previous policies. So the voice of citizens, why isn't it so as present in our Latin America? It's as if education were a problem of the Minister of Education or the technicians of the ministry, but not of the citizens, you know? Well, there's something that happens with education, and you kind of mentioned it. It's a bit perverse in the sense of how it's valued by people. People care about what happens with the economy, with safety and education. I mean, as long as there is a school in my neighborhood that's quite complete, that has teachers for everyone, I mean, then I'm satisfied. The surveys that the Mexican Statistics Institute does showed this clearly. So there isn't a level of organic active demand that requires a change in attitude regarding these types of decisions or changes. And we don't reap the results quickly. It's easier and faster to build a soccer stadium in the city. I mean, that's something that can be seen. It gets you votes, you know? I mean, improving educational results takes long. And this is something that we need to work on. And lastly, I would say that we are going through very interesting times. It's a time to think outside the box to guarantee that we continue having public policies for education. We had our colleagues talking about this before. We have advanced a lot in information, empirical data, surveys, studies, but it's not enough. We have to work harder on instruments that are legislative, political, and that allow us to guarantee the hows. And in the long run, we have ministers and vice ministers that will, I mean, they last 2 years, 3 years max. And the ministers of Supreme Courts and central banks, they are in their positions for 8, 10, 15 years. So I'm wondering, how can we in education reach this level of stability in the long run, and that is protected by from political changes?
Gracias, Otto.
Thank you so much, Otto. How interesting. I don't know if anyone would like to comment anything, but what I want to say after everything you've all said is, and this has to do with the question that I asked Otto a bit ago, and regarding what Gloria just asked, the silence the silence in citizens, because Gloria was talking about this issue that we have in the region and lack. And this was all corroborated by Otto. In educational issues, citizens don't have a lot of opinions on that. So how is it that this silence increases the voice of more activist groups like political groups, entrepreneurial groups, union groups? So these groups that are called the interest groups. How is it that this consensus could help us? I mean, it's not a consensus between citizens because most citizens don't have an opinion about this, but how do we get these players to collaborate?
Sí, lo que pasa es que yo creo que con
Pablo,
frecuencia nosotros
I think that
enfocamos
many
mucho en lo
times
técnico y
we
descuidamos
focus on the technical aspects
y
and we don't focus on the political aspects as much.
desde la lógica
And we
de
talk about
discusión,
politics from the idea of reaching a consensus to
que esta es
generate
lo
legitimacy.
lo que se debe hacer.
And that is, in theory, what we should do.
La política. Y estamos tomando
But
decisiones en el más alto nivel político, en donde
I
se
mean,
van a
we're
tomar
making
decisiones
political
para
decisions,
intereses.
and
Una de
there are a
las
lot of
personas
interests at
en
stake
el chat dice,
in these
"¿Cómo hacer una
spheres.
reforma
Somebody in the
contra
chat
los
said, well,
maestros?
you can't do a reform against educators because educators are the ones that are in classrooms. And that's true, but we also can't have a reform for the right of education that if our educators don't have what they need in order to achieve that. So educators are also a group of interests, and there are others, of course. At a curriculum level, we have all the anti-rights movements and groups. So I do think that we're not being political enough. We're not doing enough politics when it comes to education. And maybe we should, that way the citizens are more represented and not only these interest groups.
That's a very interesting point.
Ya se pasaron los 14 minutos. Si
I'm
puede-
sorry, but your 14 minutes are up, but if you could put away that idea, because we're really talking about participation, legitimation, participation. Now let's listen to Patricia's. You have 8 minutes, and when you have 2 minutes left, I will tell you, and then we will have 14 minutes of discussion. And then Otto can come back with that comment. Just hold your comment there. I hope I won't forget my comment. Write it down, write it down. Well, I'm going to put myself within the situation because we wanted to do a reform of the educational entity, and of course, the urban sectors are always ahead of the rural areas. So we wanted to implement an equality policy for the rural environment to include that systemically. Of course, our budget increase was significant. I think I had about an increase of $250 million, but everything was in a logic that, okay, you have this money to invest permanently, but no, the logic was this is your investment, capital investment budget. So we thought that maybe we could use investment funds that are not for current expenses, but we thought that we could articulate investment in infrastructure, which was the main objective of this type of fund with a teaching model and with teaching training strategies on the field in the classroom. That seemed an interesting combination, especially with the participation of experts and with the system management design, because it has to work in the school. In a rural population that's connected in networks. And of course, the local management units, which are the closest educational authorities close to them, they should be responsible for management. So these are public investment projects that are done only once. It's a one-time process. So this implied a rupture with the tradition of how the budget is defined. So planning, the budget planning for that really was a very complicated issue. And I said one of the threats we have is that we did not know how the public management operates this dynamic. Of course, it doesn't have the required number of people, and it doesn't go as deep as it should to be able to penetrate that kind of fog and understand the procedures and define the roadmap. So we try to have several management agreements between our ministry and the Ministry of Finance to really shorten terms, because for everybody, time is a terrible enemy of public management, because we know that our processes are long, but our political time spans are short. And since we were talking about investment fund, they had to be invested in that single year. So we had to act fast. So acting fast led us to achieve agreements to shorten the time. But one of the lessons learned was that if you try to do something different, you're going to take a lot more time, because the public sector, since they don't know how to do things differently, it will try to protect itself. They want to protect that they will be the guilty ones for any mistake. So there's a lot of resistance, and there are a lot of questions. And when there are a lot of questions, it takes more time to answer them. So the public administrators would be more careful in going slow, so they would not commit mistakes they could be accused of. And we were not able to build a fluid dialogue between the people who approve the budget with the people who were in charge of the projects. So they clashed. We tried many times to build bridges and to articulate them, but we were more focused on management to make things be approved more quickly, instead of taking more time to see the entire flow. So we had about $250, $230 million to implement this reform. So one of the decisions made was to summon small projects. We had to work in the entire Peru, so we were talking about groups of schools in different territories as a management unit to be a design to see how the classroom works, how the school works, and the networks worked. And that was replicated in different territories. So instead of having an agreement with 24 territorial units, we did agreements with 72 rural networks. So since we had 72 projects instead of 24, that really put us into a very tight spot nationally, not only inside, but also outside public management, because we needed more clarity to be able to get the budget improvements and the project. So it was the first mistake was to pulverize too much a process that should have been a bit more concentrated. And to set up all this, we did not understand how many instruments we had to develop before that, like teaching management, school management tools and textbooks that we had to do on the fly. And then we improvise several solutions to be able to implement the project within the time frame that was established instead of focusing on getting the best results. And that posed problems to take this forward as a management model for rural areas. Okay, you finished really on time. Thank you. So we have time to continue our dialogue. Now it would be Gloria to ask a question and then Otto. Well, thank you very much, Patricia. What you just reported was the Via Crucis, the painful journey that some technical teams of the Ministry of Education have to go through when they have to implement processes with their counterparts in the Ministry of Finance. My question is, in the case of Peru, is there any type of school or governmental school for teaching technicians to specialize the teams and avoid any type of entrapment? Because, as you said, if you haven't spent your budget that sometime you will suffer, you will lose that budget.
That has to do with a reform of the public space to make it more professional, meritocratic, but it still doesn't work. I think this is an issue that goes beyond the technical capacities, the basic technical capacities, because this is like balancing a lot of different plates at the same time. So you have the political goal, the articulation and coordination beyond my technical skills. A frequent or common situation is that each department, each area, each unit makes sure that their part is okay and that they're not guilty of what doesn't work or what doesn't work out. So how do we do that? Well, we don't really get involved with others. I mean, we have achieved a lot of articulation between infrastructure, education, intercultural, bilingual, and different levels, but it's not enough. They weren't enough. Patricia, I mean, they used to say, Patricia, but you're going to highlight some things in education. I was like, no, it's not only highlighting, we have to delve into. If I'm going to innovate a management process, which is what we wanted to do, then what do I have to take into account? Right? It's not, I mean, it's about your teams. Where do you have to have political agreements beyond your own ministry or within your own ministry? You have to have technical agreements. Who do you have to talk to be able to preserve the spirit of politics and have a technical solution? I mean, those are all things that I think about and wonder. Yes, and this is all linked to what Leonardo said during his presentation today. I mean, that vision of the world of the concept of educational investment. It's seen as an expense. It is seen as a non-urgent need. And Claudio Uribe mentioned how there are at least 15 countries that have restricted or reduced their investment in education in the last years. We made it grow, actually, but the efficiency of the Ministry of Education is measured by how much they achieved by that investment. So it means how many schools did you build? And that is just a small part of the educational path. If the school dynamic with students, educators, community, curriculum aren't guaranteed in schools, then we're just putting up walls. And that's how the investment is judged. But like Pablo said, those are just the excuses. We had to redirect a lot of the budget to that, to infrastructure with other players, with municipalities and regional governments to invest in schools. We guaranteed that equity was in terms of what was required in areas of risk, rural areas, poorer areas. We made sure that there was something there, but we also weren't, I mean, it was more about demand and not necessity. I mean, these projects seek money, but in poorer areas, sometimes you have 3 or 4 employees. There is no management capacity to have a project that seeks money. So, I mean, it's more about the demand, but not the necessities necessarily. These are things that I think we have to ask ourselves, how do we go about this?
Sí, hay
Okay,
una
Otto, the floor is yours. There's a very interesting part about what Patricia just mentioned that has to do with expenses and financing, funding. Claudia has already spoken about how to reduce expenses, but I'd like Patricia's opinion on this. How do we go from a concept of more spending, more expenses to better investments, more transparent investments that waste less? Because when we ask for more money to the Ministry of Finance, the answer is always there is no more money. It's part of their DNA, it seems. So how do we get to have a funding model that is aimed at improving education of children, which is what any educational process wants to achieve, right? I would like your opinion on this. I think, firstly, we have to have a clear political agreement. I mean, the highest authority in the government has to agree with you. I mean, if not, how are you going to reach a decision in the economic part or financial part, well, with the president of the country? So the person that has to be clear on what we want to do are these like higher powers in Congress and in the executive branch. Secondly, sometimes because we spend quickly, we spend wrongly. I mean, there is the speed of the expense and then the quality of the expense. The speed is critical. Why? Well, because frequently we do spend, but we don't spend on what's more important or what's crucial. So I think that this implies a rework in public management. We have to know better what the cost structures are or the different components. I mean, what's valuable in the processes. There's a word for that, but I can't remember what it is. What's valuable sometimes is, I mean, we're sometimes forced to use them immediately with the citizens or students. And yes, that's fine. But in the middle, you have a set of things. If the educators are not doing well, like Otto said, if they don't trust you, if they don't trust the system, they won't be your ally for a curriculum reform. If they don't understand this reform and they don't support it, well, then it's hard. But if they do support it, but maybe they don't have the material or they don't have the community dynamic, then the educator questions why, how. So this is very complex. We have to understand what the different components are in order to know which ones make these expenses more of higher quality, let's say. So I think that we know what quality is on a road, but what makes quality? How can we reach quality in education? What does that look like? I think there are a lot of different interpretations. Gloria, not long ago, mentioned a citizen consultation. And this, I mean, she was asking what this takes you to. So is it something more utilitarian for work or to get into college, or is it for a better education as a whole? And that's what we have to think about. Should we prepare people to get into school and get jobs, or to be better citizens? I mean, we talk about like an integral education, but what does that really mean? What does that mean for each person? So I think that we do have to continue discussing this, but we also have to talk about the quality of the expenses. More computers, yes, that's great. We give out computers, but what do we do with those computers? And that's where we will know the educational quality that we're delivering. I think that we have to elucidate some terms and components and accept differences or dissidences in order to be able to make decisions on what educational quality means in our countries in this historical moment that we're living right now. And once again, I think it's all about making politics with citizens and not only the typical players. Okay, we're almost at the end of our panel. An idea that has appeared in every presentation has to do with this idea of educational quality. Maybe one of the educational changes that our countries have tried to carry out is due to this political urgency that Gloria and Otto mentioned. Governments do have a purpose and they want to move forward with their goals. There is there's an inevitable clash. with the people, with the population, and also in how educational reforms are done, are carried out. I mean, there's like a top-down mission that is the typical way.
Y en ese sentido me pregunto,
But it can also be from bottom up. And this is a more general question. I don't know if we'll have time to go into it really. Up till what point is it actual possible for reformist governments who have very good intentions, and I was part of one of these governments, how easy is it for them to go against the sustainability of the goals that it proposes? Precisely thinking about the fact that we have to progress quickly or advance quickly, and then it ends up being a top-down reform, a more vertical change, let's say.
Porque por entropía,
And it's doomed to be unsuccessful, right? Once that government ends, everything goes back to what was there before, right? Yes, but it's doomed in societies like ours, where we thought we didn't have to come up with policies, but rather technical solutions, where we didn't take into account the dissidents, and where we stopped talking to the population, to organizations, about what we wanted from the investments in this case. So if this debate is not permanent and ongoing, then, and this before we're in the government, and once we're in the government, we are the worst people to have a conversation with the citizens, because you have the budget. I mean, you have to decide something that is in your favor or not in your favor. So you're not the best mediator, let's say. If we don't work in society, then we will continue to keep living like this. And it'll all just depend on how long the governments are in charge. And then when the new government comes in, there can be changes. Yes, I didn't want to be pessimistic, but it sounded a little, right? I meant it as more of a possibility to reflect, because this clashes with reality, and maybe this is something that we should start pondering on. I would love to continue this debate. It has been great to hear the three of you and hear this dialogue. I mean, it really has been interesting. It is a shame that we have to finish, but I mentioned that I was going to be very strict with the times. I would love to continue, but unfortunately, we cannot. To those of you who asked all these questions, if the panelists agree, we can send these questions to them, and then we will send them back to you with the answers. You can just give us your email, and that way your questions will be answered, okay? That is our promise. Is that okay?
De nuevo, muchísimas gracias a los tres
Thank you
panelistas.
once again to the three panelists. It was great hearing you. It was great talking to you. And I wish we could continue talking. Maybe next year we can have a similar panel. Thank you again to the audience. Thank you for sending in questions. I mean, such interesting questions. But we have to continue. We have a third panel that is coming up in not long, and so we have to end this second panel. Thank you once again. Back to you, Mercedes. Thank you, everyone. Thank you very much, Pablo. Thank you very much to the panel and all of you for your attention. This concludes panel 2 of the Regional Forum.